You know what's terrifying? When something that's supposed to be solid just isn't anymore. And I'm not talking about trust issues or political institutions, I mean literally solid, like wood. Like the hull of a ship that's keeping you from drowning in the Caribbean Sea. Picture this. It's the morning of June 15th, 1670, Port Royal, Jamaica. The sun's already cooking the docks, and the harbour's doing what harbours do, ships bobbing at anchor, sailors loading cargo, merchants haggling over prices. Everything's normal. And then the Santa Isabella, a merchant vessel just sitting there peacefully at her mooring, suddenly folds in half. Not dramatically, not from cannon fire or a rogue wave. She just collapses, like someone had replaced her skeleton with wet newspaper. 43 people died that morning, 43 souls who went to bed the night before, thinking they were safe on a solid ship, only to wake up and discover their vessel had been secretly dying to round them for months. Now, here's where it gets really unsettling. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was happening everywhere. The Spanish, and we're talking about the Spanish Empire at its height, right? They counted 120 ships lost to rot in just 5 years. Think about that number. 120 vessels. That's more than Sir Francis Drake, and every pirate who ever sailed the Caribbean combined had managed to capture or sink. An invisible enemy was doing what entire fleets of warships couldn't accomplish. In London, in those cramped, smoke-filled coffee houses where the insurance men from Lloyd's gathered, they were doing some truly depressing mathematics. They calculated that a ship built in January would start showing signs of rot by December. By her second birthday, she'd be worth more as firewood than as a functioning vessel. Imagine building something that costs a fortune, something that takes a year of skilled labour to construct. And knowing before you even finish it that you've got maybe 2 years before it becomes a death trap. The culprit? A fungus called Serpula lacrimans. And the Caribbean was basically paradise for this stuff. You've got these cycles of drought and monsoon, and fungus loves that. It loves moisture, obviously, but it also loves when things dry out just enough to crack, creating new places for it to spread. The Caribbean's climate was like someone designed the perfect incubator for wood rot. There's this Dutch merchant, Jan van der Meer, and I want you to think about his situation for a second. He builds a ship not cheap, by the way, and sends it on its maiden voyage. It rots before it completes the journey. Okay, terrible luck, right? So he builds another one, same thing. Then a third. 3 consecutive ships, rotted before their maiden voyages were done. 3 fortunes, just, gone, dissolved into the sea. And the desperation this created, the sailors developed. These rituals that would seem almost comical if they weren't so tragic. They hung garlic in the holds like they were warding off vampires. They painted crosses on the deck planks. They threw silver coins into the bilge water every Sunday, hoping divine intervention might succeed where human ingenuity had failed. There's this woman, Maria Santos, a sailor's widow in Havana, who organized daily prayer groups for the fleet. She knew everyone knew that this invisible rot was killing more husbands, more fathers, more sons than every pirate on the Spanish Main combined. The powers that be weren't sitting idle, of course. The British Admiralty tried everything their engineers could dream up. Double planking, which sounds smart until you realize you're just creating more space for moisture to get trapped. Copper sheathing, which cost an absolute fortune and still failed. They even tried importing what they called sacred oak from Sherwood Forest, having Anglican bishops bless it first. Blessed wood. That's where they were at. There's this master shipwright, Thomas Hartwell of Portsmouth, and his story just breaks your heart. 30 years. 30 years of perfecting traditional ship designs, of learning every secret his masters had taught him, of becoming one of the most respected builders in England. He builds his masterpiece, the Indomitable. Beautiful name, right? Except 18 months after launch, her keel turns soft as cheese and she goes down. 30 years of knowledge, useless against fungus. The Spanish tried charring the wood the way the Romans had done centuries before. The French experimented with exotic African hardwoods that literally cost more than gold by weight. The Portuguese dug into Islamic texts from the medieval period, hoping ancient wisdom might save them. Nothing worked. Every solution failed. Every innovation crumbled, often literally. By 1671, building a ship had become this bizarre exercise in futility. You knew going in that you were constructing an elaborate coffin that would last maybe 2 summers if fortune smiled on you. The entire maritime economy of the Caribbean was teetering on the edge of collapse. Trade routes were becoming impossible to maintain. Naval power was becoming meaningless if your warships dissolved before they could reach the enemy. And here's the thing that really gets me about this moment in history. Everyone involved was smart. These weren't fools. The Spanish had been building ships for centuries. The Dutch were the best merchant shipbuilders in the world. The British had the resources of an empire behind them, and they were all losing. Collectively, completely, losing to a fungus they couldn't even see without a microscope, which, by the way, they barely had in 1670. The maritime world was dying. Insurance companies were going bankrupt. Fortunes were evaporating. Empires were watching their navies rot at anchor. Sailors were drowning because their ships turned to powder beneath their feet. Into this world of maritime desperation, into this moment when it seemed like humanity might simply have to accept that the Caribbean was unconquerable, that some places were just too hostile for wooden ships. Into this crisis sailed the most unlikely saviour imaginable, a Scottish pirate named William Morrison, whose career robbing ships had taught him more about their weaknesses than any guildmaster had ever learned from building them. So let's talk about William Windgap Morrison. And right away, you've got to appreciate that his nickname, the thing other pirates called him, had nothing to do with sword fights or captured treasure or anything remotely swashbuckling. No, he got called Windgap because he had this peculiar habit of cutting extra spaces between his ship's deck planks. Think about that for a second. You're a pirate in the 1670s Caribbean, where your reputation is literally everything, where fear is currency, and your nickname comes from carpentry modifications. It's like being a mobster, known as Tommy Two Hinges, because you're really particular about door installation. Morrison was born in Aberdeen, Scotland, in 1635. His father was a fisherman, not wealthy, not connected, just a guy who knew boats and knew the sea. William went to sea at 12 years old, which sounds shocking to us now, but that was pretty standard for the time. You learned your trade young, or you didn't eat. By 20, he'd been pressed into service by the British Navy, which is a polite way of saying they kidnapped him and forced him to work on their ships, and then they abandoned him in Barbados without pay. Without pay, after forcing him to serve. So, Morrison turned pirate. And honestly, can you blame him? For 10 years, Morrison terrorized Caribbean merchants, and he was good at it, good enough to stay alive in a profession where most men died within their first year. But here's what's fascinating. His crew mocked him for his deck modifications. These are pirates, right? Men who've chosen a life outside civilized society, who understand that survival depends on every advantage you can get. And even they thought Morrison was crazy for cutting extra gaps in the deck planks. Except, here's the thing, while other pirate vessels needed constant careening, which means dragging them up on beaches to scrape off rot and barnacles every few months, Morrison's ship Revenge stayed seaworthy for 7 straight years. 7 years. In an era when merchant vessels were lucky to make it 2 years, this pirate ship just kept sailing. It was impossible. It was legendary. And it made Morrison famous among both pirates and the merchants he was robbing. Now, Morrison didn't figure this out through formal education or studying at some maritime academy. His education came from the most unlikely sources imaginable. During a raid on a Dutch merchant in 1668, he captured this elderly shipwright named Klaus Zimmermann. Klaus had studied under the master builders of Amsterdam. These were the guys who built the ships that made the Dutch the most powerful maritime trading nation in Europe. Most pirates would have held Klaus for ransom, right? That's the business model. But Morrison kept him for 6 months. 6 months of learning about wood grain, about how fungus grows, about why Dutch flute chips lasted longer than other designs. Can you imagine being Klaus? You're expecting to be ransomed or killed, and instead you're basically running a graduate seminar in shipbuilding for a Scottish pirate who asks better questions than half the apprentices you trained in Amsterdam. Then there were the enslaved Africans, Morrison freed from a Portuguese slaver. And this is where you see something really interesting about Morrison's character. He freed them. He didn't sell them, didn't ransom them. And in return, these men taught him how their ancestors built boats in the Gold Coast region of Africa, using spacing techniques that prevented tropical decay. They'd been building boats in hot, humid climates for centuries, and they'd figured out solutions that European shipwrights, working in cooler northern climates, had never needed to discover. Morrison even learned from a captured Japanese sailor, one of the very few in the entire Caribbean at that time. This man showed him how Japanese temple builders created structures that stood for centuries in humid conditions by designing them to let the wood breathe. It's this incredible moment of global knowledge transfer happening on a pirate ship in the middle of the Caribbean. The real breakthrough came in 1672, during what would be Morrison's final pirating venture. He was hiding in a mangrove swamp near Jamaica, probably avoiding the Royal Navy or a Spanish patrol, and he spent time just observing. Watching how mangrove roots work. These things are constantly wet, right? They're standing in water 24 hours a day, and yet they never rot. They maintain these air channels throughout their entire structure. And Morrison had this revelation, this moment of pure insight. Wood needed to breathe like lungs, not be sealed like a tomb. Everything the guild shipwrights were doing, all that double planking, all that sealing and caulking, they were suffocating the wood. They were creating perfect conditions for rot to thrive in the darkness. When King Charles II offered pardons to pirates who would serve England basically an amnesty program, Morrison took it. He sailed into Portsmouth with detailed drawings of a radical new ship design. And the guild masters? They laughed at him. Actually laughed. Henry Blackwood, the senior shipwright, looked at Morrison's spacing gaps and declared they would let in more sea than a cannonball hole. Thomas Hartwell, remember him, the master builder who'd watched his masterpiece sink, called Morrison a rum-addled fool who thinks ships should have windows in their decks. These men had spent their entire lives building ships. They'd trained under masters who'd trained under other masters going back generations. And here comes this pirate from Scotland, and he's telling them they've been doing it wrong. The arrogance of it, from their perspective, must have been staggering. But Morrison found his champion in Samuel Hartley, a merchant who had lost £90,000 sterling to rotted ships. £90,000. To put that in perspective, that's the kind of money that could buy estates, that could fund small wars. Hartley was desperate enough to listen to anyone with a new idea, even a former pirate. And here's where it gets really interesting. Hartley's daughter, Elizabeth, had studied natural philosophy. This was unusual for women at the time, obviously, but Elizabeth immediately understood Morrison's breathing principle. She got it in a way that the experienced shipwrights, trapped in their traditional thinking, couldn't. Together, Elizabeth and her father raised £8,000 to build the Ventulus, that's Latin for little wind, which is just perfect, and they had to bribe local officials to overlook guild regulations. The guilds literally had laws preventing people from building ships differently than they'd always been built. The sabotage started immediately. Someone mixed sand into their tar supplies, which would have been catastrophic if they hadn't caught it. Rival builders hired thugs to attack Morrison's workers. Anonymous pamphlets appeared around Portsmouth calling Morrison a Scottish witch, claiming he was bringing cursed designs to English shores. This was serious stuff. Accusations of witchcraft could get you killed. Morrison's response? He hired his former pirate crew as guards. These were men who knew how to discourage interference with a cutlass and a pistol. Suddenly, the thugs stopped showing up. On September 3rd, 1673, Ventulus launched. The docks were packed with people who'd come specifically to mock her. They threw rotted vegetables. They shouted that she'd sink before reaching open water. The guild masters were there, arms crossed, satisfied smiles on their faces, waiting for vindication. And Morrison, this former pirate, this man who'd learned shipbuilding from a captured Dutch builder, from freed African slaves, from a Japanese sailor, from watching mangrove roots stood on deck, calm as the eye of a hurricane. He announced that any man who thought his ship would outlast Ventulus could make a wager at odds of 10-1. Nobody took the bet. For 2 years, Ventulus sailed back and forth between Portsmouth and Jamaica. 2 years of carrying sugar and rum. 2 years of Morrison's critics rubbing their hands together, waiting, almost praying for news of her sinking. They wanted vindication so badly they could taste it. Instead, something extraordinary started happening. Ships built after Ventulus, ships built the traditional way by guild masters with decades of experience, began showing rot spots within months. Not years, months. Meanwhile, Ventulus, pristine. Her timbers stayed strong, her deck remained solid. It was like she was aging in reverse while every other ship in the Caribbean was falling apart on schedule. Captain James Worthington initially did not want to command Ventulus. Think about his position. He's a respected naval officer, and they're asking him to captain a ship designed by a pirate, a ship that every guild master in England says is fundamentally unsound. His reputation is on the line. But after watching traditional ships literally fall apart during the crossing while Ventulus grew stronger, Worthington became Morrison's most vocal advocate. He'd stand in taverns and challenge anyone who doubted Morrison's design. This Royal Navy captain, defending a pirate's innovation. The ship's carpenter, a guy everyone called Old Pete Daniels, made an observation that seems obvious in hindsight but was revolutionary at the time. He swore that the gaps actually helped drain water faster during storms. See? Traditional ships would get water sloshing around in the deck, pooling in corners, sitting there for days or weeks. That standing water was perfect for rot. But on Ventulus, the water drained through those gaps Morrison had cut. The ship was self-draining. It was brilliant. Then came October 1677. The hurricane. Now, we've got to pause here and understand what hurricanes meant in this era. There were no weather satellites, no warning systems, no computer models predicting where storms would go. You got some warning from changes in the air, from how animals behaved, from the color of the sky. And then the storm hit, and you either survived or you didn't. This particular hurricane lasted 3 days. 3 days of winds that witnesses said could strip bark from trees. 17 ships were caught in Kingston Harbour when it struck. 17 vessels, their crews scrambling to secure lines, to pump out water, to just survive. When the winds finally died and the sun came out, 15 of those ships had sunk. 15. But here's the critical detail: they didn't sink from the storm's fury. They didn't capsize from the waves or get smashed against the docks. They sank because their rot-weakened timbers couldn't withstand the stress. The hurricane exposed what had been hidden. These ships were already dying, and the storm just finished the job. 2 ships survived, just 2 out of 17. One was Ventulus. The other was Rapid Return, another Morrison-designed vessel that had been built secretly by a convert to his methods. Think about those odds. The only 2 ships to survive were both Morrison designs. Not luck, not chance. Engineering. Ventulus rode out that hurricane with minimal damage. Her flexible, breathing structure adapted to the storm's violence in ways that rigid, sealed ships couldn't. She bent where other ships broke. She drained where other ships filled. She breathed where other ships suffocated. Admiral Sir John Berry witnessed the aftermath. This is a high-ranking officer in the British Navy, a man whose opinion carries weight in London. He immediately wrote to the Admiralty declaring Morrison's design essential to England's naval supremacy. That's not casual praise. That's a military leader saying, "We need this or we lose." The Dutch sent their best spy. His name was Willem de Vries, and he posed as a carpenter seeking work in Morrison's expanding shipyard. The Dutch, remember, the greatest maritime traders in the world at this time, were so desperate to learn Morrison's secrets that they resorted to industrial espionage. De Vries spent 6 months trying to steal plans before Morrison's former pirate crew caught him and gently suggested he find employment elsewhere. The French offered Morrison 50,000 livres and an estate in Normandy to relocate. 50,000 livres was enough money to live like a nobleman for the rest of your life. The Spanish, even more desperate after losing their entire Panama squadron to rot in 1678, offered him a title and 100,000 pieces of eight. A title. The Spanish, with their obsession with bloodlines and nobility, were willing to make a Scottish pirate a nobleman if he'd just build their ships. Morrison used all these offers to negotiate with the British Admiralty. He wasn't stupid, he knew his value. He secured a contract to redesign the entire English fleet. The entire fleet, from a pirate to the man responsible for the maritime power of England. The demonstration before King Charles II in December 1678 became the stuff of legend. Morrison brought two identical wooden beams. Same type of wood, same size, same everything. Except one was solid, built the traditional way. The other had breathing, channels, tiny spaces for air circulation, built Morrison's way. Both beams had been exposed to moisture for 6 months. Morrison handed the solid beam to the king. Charles II, holding this beam that looked fine from the outside, applied pressure and it crumbled in his hands. Just disintegrated. Then Morrison handed him the channeled beam. The king applied the same pressure. It held firm, strong, solid. Can you imagine being in that room? The King of England, literally watching traditional shipbuilding crumble in his hands while Morrison's innovation proved itself? But opposition didn't disappear just because the science was sound. The Catholic Church initially condemned the gaps as openings for the devil to enter. They were serious. Religious authorities were claiming that Morrison's ship design was literally inviting demonic possession. Morrison's response? He donated funds to build a chapel with specially ventilated wooden beams, and those beams outlasted stone churches in the area. Turns out the devil wasn't interested in well-ventilated timber. Traditional shipwrights formed something called the Guild of True Builders. They spread rumors that Morrison's ships were cursed, that crews who sailed them would never see heaven. This was serious psychological warfare. Sailors were superstitious by necessity, and threatening their immortal souls was hitting below the belt. Thomas Hartwell, the master shipwright who'd called Morrison a rum-addled fool, whose own masterpiece had sunk, publicly challenged Morrison to a shipbuilding contest. Each man would build a ship. After 3 years at sea, they'd compare conditions. Winner take all. Reputation on the line. Morrison accepted immediately. 3 years later, they hauled both ships out for inspection. Hartwell's Pride of Portsmouth was already taking on water. Her timbers showed extensive rot. She'd need major repairs to survive another year. Morrison's Freedom looked like she'd just left the shipyard. Fresh, strong, solid. Hartwell did something remarkable then. He could have made excuses. He could have claimed sabotage or bad luck, or that Morrison had cheated somehow. Instead, he walked over to Morrison in front of the entire crowd of shipwrights, merchants, and naval officers. He shook Morrison's hand, and he became Morrison's strongest supporter. That moment when the old master acknowledged the correctness of the new method, that's when everything truly changed. Hartwell spent his remaining years helping spread Morrison's technique throughout England, training a new generation of shipwrights who understood that tradition without adaptation was just another word for extinction. The breathing ships had won, and empires would be built on their backs. By 1685, the numbers told a story that even the most stubborn traditionalists couldn't ignore. Ships built with Morrison spacing lasted an average of 15 years compared to 3 years for traditional vessels. 15 versus 3. That's not an incremental improvement, that's a complete transformation of maritime economics. Insurance rates at Lloyd's of London dropped by 60% for Morrison-designed ships. 60%. Meanwhile, traditional designs became nearly uninsurable. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you wanted to build a ship the old way, you either couldn't get insurance at all, or you paid rates so high that the voyage was barely profitable. The market had spoken, and it said Morrison was right. The economic ripples spread across Europe in ways nobody had anticipated. Baltic timber merchants who had grown rich replacing rotted ships saw demand drop by 2/3. These were men whose entire business model depended on ships falling apart regularly. Suddenly, they were obsolete. Meanwhile, Scottish Highland forests, previously considered inferior for shipbuilding, became valuable. Morrison had proven their wood worked perfectly with proper ventilation. Scotland, poor rocky Scotland, suddenly had something England desperately needed. Port cities transformed almost overnight. Kingston, Jamaica, had 17 shipyards in 1675. By 1690, it had 5. 5 highly efficient operations instead of 17 struggling ones. That might sound like a loss, but here's the thing, those 5 shipyards employed more people and built better ships than the 17 ever had. Meanwhile, unemployed shipwrights retrained as merchant sailors. There were more ships sailing, ships that lasted longer, ships that needed crews. The jobs didn't disappear, they evolved. The British Navy's adoption of Morrison standards gave them an advantage that historians directly credit with enabling their later empire. And this is where we need to zoom out and look at the big picture, because the implications are staggering. While Spanish ships required replacement every 3 years, British vessels served for decades. That's not just a financial advantage, that's a strategic transformation of naval power. Admiral Nelson's Victory, the flagship at Trafalgar, one of the most famous warships in history, was built incorporating Morrison's evolved principles. That ship survived 150 years of service. 150 years. It's sitting in Portsmouth right now as a museum ship. A vessel built based on innovations from a Scottish pirate outlasted entire dynasties. The merchant fleet numbers are almost hard to believe. The British merchant fleet expanded from 300 to 900 vessels within 20 years. But here's the crucial detail. They didn't build 600 new ships. They expanded through reduced losses. Ships that would have rotted away kept sailing. Ships that would have sunk in storms stayed afloat. The fleet grew because vessels stopped dying. Trade routes that had been impossible suddenly became profitable. India and China were too far away when your ship might rot during the journey. But a Morrison-designed ship? It could make the round trip and come back for more. The sugar trade from Jamaica quadrupled, not because more sugar was being grown, but because ships could make regular, reliable runs. Consistency, boring, predictable consistency, became the foundation of empire. Morrison's influence extended far beyond shipbuilding. Architects working in tropical colonies started applying his ventilation principles to buildings. From Bombay to Singapore, wooden structures that used to decay within years now lasted decades. The principles were the same: let the wood breathe, don't trap moisture, think about air circulation. Agricultural storage facilities adopted breathing techniques and cut grain losses by half. Half. That's the difference between famine and surplus in some regions. The Royal Society inducted Morrison in 1688. The Royal Society, the most prestigious scientific institution in England, founded by the greatest minds of the era. And Isaac Newton himself praised Morrison's understanding of natural forces. Newton, the man who explained gravity, was impressed by a Scottish pirate who figured out how wood breathes. Women entered the shipbuilding trade through Morrison's workshops. This is remarkable for the time. The detailed work of proper spacing suited smaller hands, and Morrison didn't care about gender if you could do the work. Margaret Thompson became England's first licensed female shipwright under Morrison's mentorship. One innovation in ship design created an opening for social change that nobody had anticipated. Morrison died peacefully on November 22, 1695. He was 60 years old, wealthy beyond imagination, with a fortune of £80,000 and respected across Europe. His funeral brought together former pirates, admirals, merchants, and common sailors. The Times reported, "Never has Portsmouth seen such unity in grief. Think about that, gathering people who would normally never speak to each other, standing side by side, mourning a man who'd bridged worlds that were supposed to stay separate. Ships across the Caribbean observed a moment of silence. Crews who'd never met Morrison, who'd never sailed on his vessels, who maybe had only heard stories, they all understood that this man had conquered their greatest enemy. Not storms, not pirates, not war, rot, the invisible killer that had claimed more sailors than anything else. Today, The last surviving Morrison ship, the Endurance, sits in the Greenwich Maritime Museum in London. You can walk right up to it. You can see those deck gaps, those spaces Morrison cut into the planks that everyone said would sink the ship. They're still there after 300 years. Visitors walk past them every day, probably not giving them a second thought. They don't know they're looking at the innovation that helped Britain rule the waves for 2 centuries. They don't know that those simple gaps changed how humanity builds everything from ships to skyscrapers. Modern construction still uses Morrison's fundamental insight. Let materials breathe. Don't trap moisture. Think about air circulation. Every building with proper ventilation, every structure designed to manage humidity, owes something to a Scottish pirate watching mangrove roots in a swamp. Morrison's gravestone bears his chosen epitaph. He conquered rot. 3 words. That's all. No mention of ships saved, no listing of honours received, no description of wealth accumulated. Just 3 words that barely hint at the truth. Because William Morrison didn't just conquer rot, he changed the course of empires, transformed global trade, enabled an age of exploration, and proved that the best innovations sometimes come from the most unexpected places. From a pirate who learned to see what guildmasters, with all their training and tradition, had been blind to for centuries. Sometimes the person who solves an impossible problem is the one nobody expected. The outsider, the rule breaker, the man who cut gaps in his deck when everyone said it would sink his ship. He conquered rot, and in doing so, he helped conquer the world.